2 fires, 1 day, 4 bodies. But here is the detail that changes everything. The man investigators believed set both of those fires didn't just burn down his brother's home. He set fire to his own house too, with his wife and daughters sleeping inside. And that's still not the worst thing he allegedly did that day. This is the Colts Neck Mansion murders, a case of greed, betrayal, a secret affair, stolen money, and a single phone call that may have sealed the fate of an entire family. And when it was finally over, a judge stood in a New Jersey courtroom and called the man responsible a cold-blooded killer with no soul. Let's go back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with fire, it starts with money, and it starts with a lie. Colts Neck, New Jersey. If you've never been there, picture the kind of town that looks like it was designed by someone who wanted the American dream to have a zip code. Horse farms, rolling estates, winding driveways that disappear into tree lines before you can even see the house at the end. It's the kind of place where people don't just live well, they live quietly well. And in that world, Keith Caneiro had built something genuinely impressive. Keith was 50 years old, a tech entrepreneur, the president of a company called Square One, an IT services firm based in Asbury Park, New Jersey, co-owned with his older brother Paul. Square One had real clients. The Doris Duke Foundation alone was paying the company roughly $127,000 a month. This was not a struggling startup. It was a legitimate, functioning business. Keith's wife, Jennifer, was 45, sharp, warm, beloved. Together they were raising 2 children in a sprawling mansion on Willowbrook Road valued at around $1.5 million. Jesse was 11, Sophia was 8. This was a family with a life. Christmases and school plays and Sunday mornings and ordinary arguments about homework. They were real, and that reality is the first thing you need to hold on to, because what happened to them was not abstract. It was intimate, it was personal. It was family. Paul Caneiro was Keith's older brother, age 51 at the time. He was the vice president of Square One. He and Keith also co-owned a second business together, EcoStar Pest Management, also in Asbury Park. On paper, they were partners, 2 brothers building something side by side, the kind of story people put in LinkedIn bios. But underneath that, something had been quietly rotting for years. Paul had a wife and 2 daughters of his own. He lived in Ocean Township, about 20 minutes from the Colts Neck Mansion. And while Keith's household was thriving, Paul's financial picture was a different story entirely. Here is where this case starts to show its true shape. According to prosecutors, Paul Caneiro was secretly stealing money from the businesses he and Keith co-owned, not pocket change. Prosecutors alleged he siphoned somewhere between $75,000 and $80,000 from company accounts, money he was funneling, in part, into a secret life his family knew nothing about. Paul was having an affair, and he was financing it lavishly. Court records showed that while the businesses were struggling and Paul was on disability pay, collecting checks for surgeries he claimed had left him incapacitated, he was also simultaneously making payments on 5 luxury vehicles, 3 Porsches, a Jeep Wrangler, and an Audi Q5 SUV which he had leased for his mistress. In 2017 and 2018 alone, he spent over $85,000 on those car payments. For a man claiming disability, for a man whose businesses were tanking, for a man who was drawing a $250,000 salary from a company he was quietly bleeding dry. And then there's one more number you need to know, $90,000. The amount Paul Caneiro was later accused of stealing from the college fund belonging to Jesse and Sophia Caneiro, his own niece and nephew, of which he had been made the trustee. He was the person Keith and Jennifer trusted to protect their children's future, and prosecutors say he stole from it. Now hold all of that in your mind, because on November 19, 2018, the night before the murders, Keith Caneiro finally started asking questions. Keith had discovered that money was missing from the business accounts. He emailed his younger brother Corey, the third Caneiro sibling, laying out what he'd found and making clear he was prepared to cut Paul off entirely, cut his $250,000 salary, remove him from the company. The Dory's Duke Foundation contract was set to expire December 31st, 2018, and Keith had real concerns about renewal. The window was closing. The reckoning was arriving. And then Keith called Paul. What happened next was captured by accident on a home security camera. Keith had installed Wyze cameras throughout his home, and on the night of November 19th, those cameras recorded Keith's side of a phone call, his voice pressing his brother, asking about missing insurance payments, demanding login credentials and account access, saying the words investigators would later play for a jury, "I need to know where the money went." Paul never answered those questions. Instead, investigators allege he began planning. 18 hours later, 4 people were dead. November 20th, 2018. The first call came before dawn. A fire had broken out at Paul Caneiro's home on Tilton Drive in Ocean Township. Firefighters arrived to find the structure ablaze. Paul, his wife, and their 2 daughters made it out. No one was killed. But here is the detail that didn't emerge until later. Investigators believe Paul set that fire himself, deliberately, with gasoline, while his own family was asleep inside the building. A red gasoline can was later found on his driveway near a vehicle showing what analysts described as spot pour burn patterns, the signature of an intentional accelerant fire. Why would a man burn down his own home with his family inside? Because prosecutors argued it was the alibi. The plan was to make it look as though both Caneiro households had been targeted by an unknown outside attacker, a violent third party hunting the entire family. If Paul's house burned too, if his family appeared to be victims alongside Keith's, investigators might chase a phantom intruder instead of looking at Paul himself. It very nearly worked. But hours later, the second fire erupted at the $1.5 million mansion on Willowbrook Road in Colts Neck. When the smoke became visible, Keith's neighbor, a plastic surgeon named Dr. Boris Volstein, assumed his neighbor was burning leaves. He called and called again. Neither Keith nor Jennifer answered. Concerned, he alerted others. Emergency services were called. By the time firefighters arrived, the building was already deeply involved, flames consuming everything. It took time to push through the smoke and heat. When they did, they found them. Keith Caneiro on the front lawn, shot 5 times, 4 times in the head, once in the back. He had been outside when it happened. He may have seen it coming. Inside the house, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia, all stabbed. Jennifer had also been shot in the head. The children, an 11-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl, had been stabbed repeatedly. Jesse, who weighed 95 pounds, had his arm pressed against his chest when the knife went through it and into his upper body. 5 stab wounds. And Sophia, 8 years old, 45 pounds. The forensic pathologist who examined her testified at trial that she suffered at least 17 stab wounds, including wounds to her face. Almost her entire body bore injuries. The medical examiner testified that Sophia died trying to dodge the knife. She was 8 years old and she was running. Investigators from the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office moved quickly, and almost immediately, 2 parallel tracks of evidence began converging on Paul Caneiro. The physical evidence first. When investigators searched Paul's Ocean Township home after the fire, they found something extraordinary in the debris of his basement. A pile of clothing. Inside that pile, a pair of bloody jeans. DNA testing would later confirm that the blood on those jeans came from Sophia Caneiro and Jesse Caneiro, the niece and nephew Paul was supposed to protect. But it didn't stop there. In that same debris pile, investigators found black nitrile gloves with Sophia's DNA on them, a scarf with Sophia's hair, an Eddie Bauer shirt with Paul's DNA, a t-shirt with more of his DNA. This was not contamination, this was contact, the kind of contact that only happens one way. When they searched his car, investigators found his passport, a gun barrel, and a night vision accessory designed to attach to a firearm. And the gun itself, A firearms expert testified at trial that the bullets recovered from the Colts neck crime scene, the bullets that killed Keith Caneiro, were fired from a weapon recovered from Paul Caneiro's home. But here is where it gets even more calculated. Paul Caneiro, investigators say, had deliberately disabled the security cameras at his own home before the night of the murders. He knew they were there. He knew what they could capture. He turned them off. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Keith's Wyze cameras in Colt's neck had been running, and they had already done their work. Paul Caneiro was arrested the day after the murders, initially on charges related to the arson of his own Ocean Township home. The murder charges followed. When police searched his car and found the passport, the gun components, and the night vision equipment, it became clear this was not a man who had been caught off guard. He had been preparing to run. Within weeks, a 16-count indictment was unsealed, 4 counts of murder, aggravated arson, weapons offenses, theft, misapplication of entrusted property, hindering his own apprehension. He was denied bail and would remain in the Monmouth County Jail for the next 7.5 years. And then began one of the longest, most legally complicated pretrial stretches in recent New Jersey criminal history. The delays accumulated like sediment, pretrial hearings, evidence battles, a lengthy fight over whether the DNA evidence, analyzed using Nuisant Aramix probabilistic genotyping software, could be admitted at trial at all. That fight alone stretched through years of hearings. Then came 2020, and the courts shut down almost entirely. Paul's defense attorney, Monica Massalone, argued aggressively throughout. She challenged the DNA methodology. She pushed back on the financial motive narrative. And in a move that generated real controversy, she pointed to the third Caneiro brother, Corey, as someone investigators had never seriously considered. She argued that because Corey's DNA had never been taken and tested, the DNA evidence couldn't conclusively rule him out. Investigators testified directly to this. Lieutenant Patrick Petroziello of the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office took the stand and said clearly, Corey Caneiro was never a suspect in this investigation. We followed the evidence. The evidence always led us to Paul Caneiro. Massalone also told the jury that Paul would never have harmed his brother, that Keith was his favorite person in the whole world. A jury would ultimately decide whether to believe that. The trial of Paul Caneiro finally began on January 12, 2026, more than 7 years after the night of the fires. What prosecutors laid out over weeks of testimony was a complete picture, not just the night itself, but the architecture of betrayal that had been constructed around Keith Caneiro without his knowledge for years. The financial detective work came first. A financial crimes investigator walked the jury through voluminous bank records and insurance accounts. She laid out the luxury car payments, the disability fraud, the nearly $80,000 in alleged stolen funds, the affair. Then came the Wyze camera recordings. The jury heard Keith's voice live from the night before his death, pressing his brother about missing money, demanding access, asking the question that, according to prosecutors, signed his death warrant. Then came the forensic testimony, the gun, the jeans, the gloves, the DNA found in 5 separate locations on those bloody pants in Paul's basement, Paul's own DNA on clothing in the same pile, the disabled home cameras, the gasoline can. And then the autopsy testimony. The day the jury heard how Jesse and Sophia died, one juror told his wife that evening, it was a heavy day. Paul Caneiro, sitting at the defense table, was seen wiping his eyes during autopsy testimony about Sophia, the 8-year-old girl whose DNA was on his jeans. The prosecution's closing argument pointed directly at the defendant. Deputy First Assistant Monmouth County Prosecutor Christopher Decker told the jury, "We would have seen it if someone else did it, but we didn't because it was him." He pointed at Paul Caneiro across the courtroom, and that's why he shut off the cameras. After 5 hours of deliberation, 5 hours for a case that had taken 7.5 years to reach a jury, they returned. Guilty. 4 counts of first-degree murder, aggravated arson, weapons offenses. Guilty on everything that mattered. May 19, 2026, the sentencing. Jennifer Caneiro's mother, Bet Carides, stood at the podium in the center of Monmouth County courtroom and spoke directly about what her family had lost. She noted, quietly devastating, that Jennifer and Keith had shared the same birthday, and now they share the same date of death. She noted that her husband, Wyze, had died before the trial concluded. He never got to see justice arrive. "Remove this killer, this monster, from society for good," she said. Jennifer's sister, Bonnie Carides, addressed the court. "An entire branch of our family was erased 7.5 years ago, 2 days before Thanksgiving. The calculation and selfishness required to look his own niece and nephew in the eyes and murder them, an entire family, is a level of evil that is not comprehensible." Paul's defense attorney asked that the life sentences be served concurrently. The judge said no. Judge Mark Lemire called Paul Caneiro a manipulative, cold-blooded killer. He described the murders as carried out with cold, deliberate malice. He sentenced Paul to 4 consecutive life terms, 1 for each member of the family he wiped out. Paul Caneiro will spend every remaining day of his life in a New Jersey state prison. Outside the courthouse, Monmouth County Prosecutor Raymond Santiago did not soften his words. "This defendant is pure evil," he said. "He annihilated an entire family." There is a version of this story that is about greed, about a man who stole money, got caught, and killed to protect his secret. That version is true. But there's another version of this story that sits underneath that one and is harder to look at directly. Paul Caneiro was the trustee of Jesse and Sophia's college fund. Keith and Jennifer chose him. They believed he would protect their children's future while they were still alive to build it. He stole from it. He set fire to his own home while his wife and daughters were asleep inside, using them as props in an alibi. He endangered them without a second thought. And then he went to his brother's house and he killed everyone in it, including the children who had trusted him enough to call him uncle. Behavioral researchers who study familicide often describe a specific psychological pattern in cases like this. A person who has constructed a false identity over years, the successful businessman, the family man, the steady older brother, and who, when that identity begins to collapse, doesn't grieve the lie, they protect it at any cost. Paul Caneiro spent years building a version of himself that couldn't survive contact with the truth. The disability checks and the Porsches, the mistress's Audi and the stolen college fund, the $250,000 salary and the missing $80,000. He wasn't just stealing from Keith, he was maintaining a fiction about who he was. And when Keith made that phone call on November 19, 2018, when he said, "I need to know where the money went," that fiction finally started coming apart. The response, prosecutors argued, was not remorse, it was not confession, it was calculation. It was murder. 8 years, 7.5 of them waiting, 2 fires, 4 lives, 5 hours of deliberation, 4 consecutive life sentences. Jennifer's sister said it best, an entire branch of a family erased 2 days before Thanksgiving. Jesse would be 18 now, Sophia would be 15. Think about that for a moment. They should be here. Jesse might be thinking about college. Sophia might be figuring out who she is. Instead, they are forever 11 and 8, found inside a burning house, their DNA left behind on clothing in their uncle's basement. Paul Caneiro will die in prison. He will not see another Thanksgiving outside of a cell. And while that is the correct outcome, the only possible outcome, it doesn't bring them back. It doesn't fill the void that Bonnie Carides described, the permanent, agonizing void. Here is the question I keep coming back to, and I want you to sit with it. The phone call happened on November 19th. The murders happened on November 20th, 18 hours in between. Somewhere in those 18 hours, Paul Caneiro made a decision. Was that decision made in a moment of panic, a man who felt cornered, who ran out of options and ran straight into the darkest possible choice? Or was this something he had considered before, something that, when Keith finally pushed hard enough, had already been thought through? Because the answer to that question tells us something different about who Paul Caneiro actually was behind all of it. And maybe that's the question that makes this case impossible to set down. What do you think happened in those 18 hours? Let me know in the comments, because I don't think any of us are going to stop thinking about this case for a very long time.